Good afternoon. My name is Kurt Organista. I'm a professor here at the School of Social Welfare. I want to welcome everybody here that is here in person, but also everybody that is attending by Zoom. We do have some Q&A at the end of the at the end of the talk, and the way we're doing that is if you're attending by Zoom, just put your questions in the chat, and we will have somebody moderate those. We always begin with a land acknowledgement, and I've heard from some Native friends and colleagues that this means a lot to them, and it means a lot to many of us. So our school has crafted a lovely statement there. Normally I would have people read that, but you never know. There might be some people out in the Zoom attendance who can't read it for whatever reason. So I'm going to go ahead and read that. It's on my screen far too small. So let me do this. Before we begin this event, we take a moment to recognize that Berkeley sits on the territory of Huichin, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo Ohlone, the successors of the historic and sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people. We recognize that every member of the Berkeley community has benefited from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1868. Consistent with our values of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native people. By offering this acknowledgement, we affirm the Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold University of California, Berkeley more accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous people. We know that many of you are spread throughout the world on the land of other people, and would like to take this time to acknowledge that ancestral history as well. I want to start by saying that as of this week, the governors of Texas, Arizona, and Florida have shipped unannounced about 13,000 Latinx migrants to the sanctuary cities of New York, Chicago, Washington, D.C., including outside of the home of the D.C. home of Vice President Kamala Harris. And Governor DeSantis in Florida has actually flown migrants to Martha's Vineyards, which many of you know is a lovely resort island outside of Massachusetts, with very little, if any, services to accommodate refugee men, women, and children dumped there. I know that Walter A. Friedlander, for whom this distinguished lecture is named and endowed, would be very disturbed by such a racist, anti-Latino, and political spectacle. And here's why. Friedland was born and raised in Germany. He was educated at the University of Berlin, where he completed a degree in law and social sciences. He joined the Berlin School of Social Work in the early 1920s, dedicating a life to service to families and children. Just as the National Socialist Party of Adolf Hitler came to power, and they actually set out to arrest him, he actually narrowly escaped arrest, immigrating with his family to France, where he became, and I want to underscore this for the purposes of this talk, he became the executive director of the Paris-based social and legal services to German refugees, hundreds of thousands of whom were escaping Nazi Germany. His work was widely recognized. It was very much admired. In fact, in the late 1930s, he was hired at the University of Chicago School of Social Services Administration, where I believe our Associate Dean, Susan Stone, attended graduate school. And I think also Professor Tina Sachs also attended the Chicago School of Social Services Administration. But here's where it gets good. Then he arrived at the fantastic UC Berkeley School of Social Welfare, where he advanced to professor And amongst his 200 publications, he wrote some classic textbooks such as Introduction to Social Welfare and International Social Welfare, which is why these talks tend to have a very international flavor, because he was a globalist that way and he saw social work that way. I also know that our distinguished invitee to give this year's Friedlander lecture, Luis H. Zayas, is also disturbed by the dumping of Latino refugees by right-wing governors who do it with almost a gleeful arrogance. For this and many other reasons, I'm delighted that Luis is here to share some of his thoughts on this matter, in addition to his ongoing work on the impact of deportation and detention on Latino children and families. Following this brief introduction here, he said to keep this brief. Luis H. Zayas is a professor in the Steve Hicks School of Social Work at the University of Texas, Austin, where he holds the R.L. Sutherland Chair in Mental Health and Social Policies. Zayas is also professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at the Dell Medical School, also at UTA. His recent research and clinical work, and I want to emphasize that lovely balance that some professors hold in schools of social work. His current work focuses on the deportation of undocumented immigrant parents and on the detention of asylum-seeking families of Central American background. I'm so glad you're doing that. This tends to often be such a Mexican-centric issue for obvious reasons, but we have to include other folks that are impacted. He is the author of Forgotten Citizens, Detention, Children, and the Making of American Exiles and Orphans, published in 2015. And his forthcoming book, which I assume you're working on during your sabbatical, is Through Iceboxes and Kennels, How Immigration Detention Harms Children and Family. We are delighted to have you here, Luis. Bienvenido.
Thank you very much, Professor Organista. I appreciate the introduction and that it's brief as it can be. And I want to thank you and Dean Linda Burton for the invitation to be here today. I was mentioning to Dean Burton that I had been here once before to give a talk early on before that book came out. And then another time I came to see one of the football games where Texas beat Cal. But even the Uber drivers couldn't get near the stadium, so I had to do a lot of walking. I'm a football fan, if you haven't guessed. So when I first set out to do this lecture, I was going to talk about the two groups of kids I've been studying, which are the U.S. citizen children of undocumented immigrants, mostly Mexican, and what happens to them when their parents get deported. But given the concerns, the stunts, the ploys, the awful things that have been done by Southern governors to these newly arrived folks, I thought I'd just focus in on what's happening there. So I'm going to focus on asylum seekers, the impact of migration, detention, separation, and then 2018 family separation period, and now on the busing of children and their psychological or psychosocial well-being. There's a new book out by Adam Serwer, he's a journalist, that is titled Cruelty is the Point, Why Trump's America Endures. But his book is not really about so much Trump, but if you take a look at American history, cruelty is the point. You hurt people to keep them down. It's why American culture and politics over its histories has used injustice and violence since the country's founding. Even our favorite friend, Ben Franklin, didn't want the Swedes and the Germans here because they were not going to be people that we wanted into this country. So the whole idea of keeping others out goes back to the 1700s and earlier. Serwer reflects in this book on Cruelty is a Point on the antecedents and methods that have perpetuated racism, injustice, and violence, all of which continue to plague this country today, as we all know. And busing is just another form of it, of that violence. It's a different sort of violence, but it's a violence, a cruel act on people who really all they wanted was safety. And so I'm glad you gave us a little bit on Dr. Friedlander, Professor Friedlander, because I thought, his story really would resonate with the, or rather the current situation would resonate with what he experienced. And I think he perhaps better than anyone would have appreciated, better than most of us understood how these forces come together to drive you out of a country. In his case, it was Nazism, but for many of our people, it's violence, climate change, political instability, police ineffectiveness, local and international gangs and drug cartels. And so I think Professor Friedlander would, I believe, had shown great empathy for these displaced, huddled masses who are really here yearning to breathe free. They arrive seeking safety and security, but encounter instead government policies and national politics that add suffering on top of what they've already suffered or what they are escaping. I also think Professor Friedlander would have relished the story that was in the New York Times this week, and it was titled, the headline is, "After Texas Sent Him to Washington, One Migrant Launches a New Life." It's a story of a 29-year-old man from Venezuela who arrives at the southern border penniless. And he took up Governor Abbott's offer of taking a bus to Washington, D.C. And lo and behold, within a couple of months, he's got jobs, he's making $600, $700 a week. He's everything we know about immigrants. They work, they're honest, they want to succeed. And of course, he's sending money back to his 6-year-old son in Venezuela and his wife and hoping to bring them someday. So rather than being a drag on the economy, which is what they're so concerned about down south in my state, he's really already producing and showing Governor Abbott that he's wrong. He's really wrong, that he is sending out people who would otherwise be able to contribute to Texas. And rather than a drag on the economy, he has made a contribution to the local economy. There's a quote from him. He said, "There is so much opportunity here." You can imagine in his Venezuelan accent, right? There's so much opportunity here. You just have to take advantage of it. And so the families that I'm going to be talking about to you today are very much like the man in that story, who just simply sought safety, a chance to survive with their families and give their families the most chances for survival and advancement in their country. What's interesting too is that through all of the interviews I've conducted as part of the research, which will be listed up here in a second. Actually, maybe I should just tell you what I'm talking about before I look here, but tell you what I'm talking about. They were forced out. Almost to a person, they told me, "We don't want to be here. We didn't want to leave Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, wherever it is that they're coming from. We were fine there until the gangs primarily and the police complicity just made it impossible." Now, some of them are coming because of the result of climate change, where you've got these oscillations between droughts and heavy rainfall and washing away the earth, and so all the consumer crops and the agriculture that they know has gone away. So they were forced out, and they do it for their families and their children. And I like this one quote in her book, The Undocumented Americans. Carla Cornejo Villavicencio tells of a Guatemalan day laborer she interviewed in New Jersey. And he came, like all others, to make money, enough money to send his kids to school back home and to take care of them. He says very, very knowingly, "Everyone who kills themselves through their work is doing it for their children." Everyone that kills themselves is really doing it for their children. If you don't have kids, why kill yourself doing this? And it's very true. And the families I've studied all did it, not because of themselves, but because of their children's future. So anyways, let me get to the point of my talk. I want to introduce that and get to the nitty-gritty of what I've got to say about asylum-seeking families and children. And I just want to disclose that I'm funded by the National Institutes of Health. Doing this study, we've got another one on the U.S. citizen children who are in Mexico. We've got this interesting project going on, and we're just beginning to crunch the data on that. As an interesting aside, in Mexico, I could not go there. I'm Puerto Rican. I would not have been able to get a study going in Mexico without a team in Mexico who understood And one little thing that you'll never see published in any of my papers is that we had to talk to the local cartels to let us do the research. So they had their own IRB, human process, and we went through it, which is to say we're not going to upset your business or your distribution. But it's a fascinating story about the kids who are now living there and what it means to them. Some who will remain in Mexico and pursue lives there, and many who will come back to California and Berkeley to come to school. I also want to point out that I'm going to show you some graphic photos and videos that might be disturbing to some of you. I think at a school of social work, they should not be disturbing because, after all, it's, we're like firefighters, right? We run to the fire, we run to the suffering, not away from it. But anyways, I'll give that to you because some of you might then yell at me if I don't tell you. So your discretion is advised, there are 2 doors you can leave. So I'm going to focus on asylum-seeking families and children from Central and South America. I want to talk to you about the stages of migration that we discerned in the research that we've done, and then how U.S. immigration enforcement really does harm kids, and then the impact on them. And as mentioned before, this is part of what the forthcoming book, Oxford University Press, which I already wrote. I wrote as a dean because I needed to get away from students. So I decided, shut the door, tell my assistant, don't let anybody in, and I got work done. And so I'm so popular, I was popular with those students. Anyways, so among these kids, these families are the idea of busing, right? They, as Professor Organista mentioned, they've been coming to Chicago, Washington, New York City, and Martha's Vineyard, and I'm sure they'll be in Berkeley sooner or later. One of our governors will send them here to Berkeley because, after all, you all are a liberal bastion in this town. And the orientation that I take, empirical and theoretical, are human migration. It's everybody migrates. We have to migrate. Although most people in the world live and die within 4 miles of their birthplace. In the U.S., in developed countries, we might go out 45, 50 miles on average. That sort of thing. But people migrate for all sorts of reasons from the biblical times, right? When you have to go to the find the promised land. I want to talk about human development, the neurobiology of stress and trauma, only a little bit on that, but also on the attachment and how the family separation policy really did a great deal of damage to children. From my research, we've been able to separate these 4 stages of Central American migration. And it starts with the pre-migration experience. And there's this slope, as you see, which really is an indication of the intensification of issues, problems, struggles that the families are having in their native countries. And I try to put in their little bumps along the way. And then there's a moment, this trigger event, that leads to them saying, I'm out of here. We're leaving, let's go. And it's not one. It's typically a series, but it's a series that reminds them of everything they've had happen to them. Usually, one thing doesn't trigger it, but it's this escalation, and that's that slope. And then they leave. And then they go through the mid-migration journey, which has all sorts of issues there. You see there's dips and rises. It can be very terrible for some families. And then they arrive at the border and they enter into U.S. detention. And they have to approach the border and request asylum. And so they do. I put in there also critical incidents in the middle because anything can happen from family separation to incidents while in detention with guards and companies and so on. I'm working on a case right now of a now 6-year-old boy who was 4 years old when he was detained with his father in Carnes Detention Center in 2020, and his father suicided in the cell with the boy. And so the boy is now back in Honduras, and I'm flying there the next couple of weeks to do an evaluation of him, part of my clinical thing, because we are suing the private prison. And that's the kind of incidents that I'm talking about, not light incidents, but very serious ones. And then in detention, they also anticipate this rise, kind of the intensity. I'm getting closer to being released, and then the release happens, and then they enter the United States. They're allowed in. And in the distance, you see a little courthouse. That's when the court hearing is. Now, it's years away in many cases. It's no longer that it could be done. It's just that the flow is great. And those 2 million numbers that you're hearing about, read carefully what they mean. There's not 2 million people. That's 2 million apprehensions, many of which were sent back. And when you figure it out, it's really those who are entering the United States is clearly not 2 million people. So the pre-migration factors and the decision to leave. And here's one of the graphic images that I'm referring to. This is the pre-migration struggle of many people in Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, even Nicaragua to some extent. But you know, the presence of death and violence around you. Even our post-traumatic stress disorder checklists don't capture the kind of immersion in the violence that they're facing. But here it's just, you know, being able to see bodies. As you see the little girl on the bottom right and the little girl in the top center, what it must be like to see those dead bodies. And in a couple of minutes, I'll come back to what that means to see that kind of image. And these are more recently what we saw, you know, in Venezuela, the empty grocery stores, right? And people looking for food wherever they could find it. The children being fed. In that picture, that boy the mom for the past 2 years has been going to a food shelter every day, a food shelter, some kind of food place where they're giving free foods, one a day for a baby, to try to feed a baby once a day. This is what's happening. I want to show you a drawing that a boy did for me in Carnes Detention Center back in 2014, 15, I forget exactly. But anyways, his name is, call him Danny. He was from Honduras. And I'm asking him to draw what was it like? I'd had a chance to meet with him at the request of his attorney who was working on the case. And he said, in my little town, we had the Rebos Locos. I don't know, I looked it up. I don't know what the Rebos Locos look like, but there was a band by that name some time ago. But in his town, these were the gang members. And they were bad guys. And I said, why are they bad guys? Because he says, in the middle picture there, says, they carry firearms and they smoke cigarettes. He had learned something about the harms of guns and smoking. And that they would shoot all over the place. They would hurt people. You see at the bottom right, somebody dead in a casket. They were bad guys. They had not, however, affected, at that point, affected him. If you look, this is the drawing of a 6.5-year-old, 7-year-old boy. And at the bottom, at the top right, you see the distressed sun. Usually our kids, a normal kid would give you a bright sun with a smile and everything, colors and flowers and, flower boxes in the windows of their houses and so on. Not this kid. You see houses on fire and things like that. Then I said, what happened to you? And so this is when the trauma hit home and forced his family to leave. His father and mom, his family, and his uncle's family, maternal uncle, and his family lived nearby on this cerro, on this mountainside. And then the grandparents also lived within walking distance of one another. So on that day, these Rebos Locos, you see them shooting at birds, walked into his uncle's home, the far left, and shot him dead. And you can see the blood seeping out of the uncle's head. Above, you see the grandparents really so alarmed when they had heard that their son had been shot dead. Danny tells me he ran to his uncle's house, and he tells me one thing. He says, it was awful what I saw, and I saw my uncle's teeth protruding out of the back of his head. Now, you're figuring he's 6 years old at the time. He's 7 by the time give or take, by the time I see him. How does a 6-year-old know about teeth protruding unless they've seen it and they know that that's what bullets do, disfigure people? And he says his mother down at the bottom right is crying and his father's upset. And that was the moment at which the family said, we have got to flee. We've got to flee and just leave the country. Again, the son is horrified by the tragedy in his family. So they decide, let's get going. And they start out, but they can't go very far. Because, as you notice at the bottom right, the father is a single leg amputee. And he's on crutches, although he drew only one crutch there, but he had 2 crutches, of course. And they try to flee, but just the terrain is impossible. You're trying to ford rivers and streams, and it's hard. So they returned, they waited a couple of days, and they tried again. But this time, it was the same. They just could not leave. So his father said to, the husband said to the wife, take our sons and save them. And that's what she did. And so they traversed Guatemala, Mexico, and arrived at the detention center where I met them. At that point, we didn't know what had happened to his father. Whether he was dead or alive, the Rebos Locos may have killed him because, after all, now you've not only do we kill your brother-in-law, but now you're fleeing and your family's gone away. There might be trouble. Who knows? But I obviously didn't keep in touch. I know he's living somewhere in Central Florida, which is nice. The boy Danny is, but we don't know much more. But that's the sort of thing that drove his family home. Now, I want to get back to that witnessing of violence, right? Death, the immediate death. When you see someone whose body is torn up as a result of violence, whether it's an automobile accident or something like that, it's stressful. It could even be traumatic. And in fact, witnessing death, a dead body, or someone at the moment that they receive a serious injury adds a large part of the burden of PTSD because it adds to the symptom duration, it affects the memory and the sense of helplessness, and it forms the memories that become intrusive and vivid. I think all of us at some point of our life may have seen an awful automobile accident that we've driven by, and we might see what's happened to the occupants of the car or what have you, and you realize, oh gosh. I mean, I've got a couple of those images in my mind of times in my life when all of them automobile accidents where I saw someone dead and just, it was awful. So they still stay with me, not in a necessarily post-traumatic stress now, but still they're vivid in my recollection. And seeing and witnessing death or a dead body or someone being injured is probably one of the most distressing elements of trauma, particularly if it happens time and again. And in countries like this, you might see this often. So that's that first part. Then they engage in the mid-migration journey, right? They take off, but along the way, who can they trust, right? They might hire coyotes to bring them, but there's criminal elements along the way, and there's organized gang. We heard stories of rival coyotes killing their coyote and then demanding more money, holding them in bodegas, warehouses, and empty buildings until more money was gotten from their families back home to bring them to the U.S. border. They witness violence and death, and of course they're victimized. They're imprisoned, as I mentioned, deprived, intimidated, physical abuse, sexual assault, all over the place. And so that mid-migration journey involves, risks and challenges. Even La Migra, right? The term for all migration officials and police is also one of the risks because they take your money. They might engage in sexual assaults on the women and maybe even some of the boys, but women and girls. And there's a lot of other hazards. So even though they may be protecting their countries from immigration, they're also not necessarily doing good things. And in the model that I showed you, you have to think about timeframes as being different for some families, for every family. Some families will take months to do that. Others will take a matter of days. They can hit all the spots, all the buses and coyotes are effective in getting them there. So it's not necessarily all in the same time frame. Some families will spend more time. I had a family who spent a great deal of time in Mexico, several months, nearly 6 months, working and accumulating more money so that they get to the border, and finally they did. But those are some of the images of the people that, the migrants during the migration. Then, once they arrive at the border, they're immediately detained. They're apprehended by the Customs and Border Protection if it's in between legal entry points. If it's on a bridge or a checkpoint, it might be the Immigration and Customs Enforcement. From there, they might go into hieleras and perreras, and I'll tell you about those in a minute. Hieleras are ice boxes. Perreras are kennels or dog pounds that you've probably seen all the images of the kids who were separated in these kind of kennel enclosures with chain link fencing. They call the detention centers family residential centers, very quaint, right? But they're really prisons, and they're run by private prisons. the GEO group is one. The other one is the Corrections Corporation of America, which has changed its name to the lofty title of core civic, as if though they're doing us a favor. And they're also, many of them are on the New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ or one of those. So I heard a story of the owner of, I think it was the Correction Corporation, that in his office he has a ticker tape kind of going across showing how core civic is doing these days. In the book, I tell you, read the book and I'll tell you the story anyway, so here's a spoiler alert. I had given a talk in San Angelo, Texas, where to the local Republican group, I think it was, because they didn't care what I had to say. But they were alumni of the University of Texas. So that evening, I'm sitting back at the hotel with friends, and we're chatting away. And a gentleman joins us across the way. It was one of these fire pits with nice little rocks in them, the flames coming up, really sweet, and we're having drinks. And so this guy comes in, and he's having his cigarette over there. And so one of my friends, these friendly Texans, I'm a New Yorker by origin, so it's like, I'm not friendly to anybody. But they hey, so how are you? Oh yeah, I'm here. I work for the local. I'm a regional manager for the local prison. I said, oh, that's the GEO group. We run that. I said, oh. I said, isn't that the same group that runs the family center in Carnes? And he only had 2 words to reply. He says, cash cow. Cash cow. That's how he saw the charges, only as cash cows, because they do get paid like $300 per night per person, whether the bed is occupied or not. And then comes so this family separation policy of 2018. This is what a hielera looks like, okay? It's kept at about 55 degrees AC, and then lights on all night, the fluorescent light on, now they're probably LED, or they should be, all night with all sorts of noise, no food, two pieces of bread with a slice of ham, and probably cheap ham, and water or juices for the kids. And as you see here, if you look at these images, in the back you see the yellow water containers, coolers, and one of them it's orange. Well, they're sitting on a half wall. Behind that half wall is a toilet. So you have 30 people in there who have just come from this awful, journey, unbathed, still in the clothes that they came in, and hungry, and they have to do their business in the presence of everybody else. That's part of the intentional cruelty. The cruelty is the point, to make it hard. Because they thought, if we do this, they'll stop coming. Well, we know that deterrence hasn't worked. They keep coming because they'd rather face this than face what they have at home. And if you're gonna die at home sitting like a sitting duck, as they say, I'd rather take my chances and die on the way here. But this is disgraceful. And I learned 2 things. One, that some of the little girls would sleep right around the toilet because somehow it was warmer there at night. The other is that one of the mothers was telling us that what they did as a group of mothers, they would create human barriers every time someone needed to go to the bathroom. So they'd get up, person would go, they'd turn around and create a barrier so at least that person in there had some privacy. This is part also of the kind of support that migrants will give to each other. When folks are in detention, and there's 2 elements that really create the trauma, what's called detention trauma. One is the deprivation, the absence of the typical developmentally expected interaction with the outside world. Kids should be able to ride bikes, go to the candy store, walk with their friends to school, go to the playground, churches, what have you, but it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. So there's that deprivation. Children are not experiencing, or even parents are not experiencing what they need to do in the world. The other element is threat. There's an ongoing psychological threat, physical threat to them by the presence of guards who are not necessarily nice people. Some of them are. I shouldn't say that all of them. There are some who are honest, good people who are just doing the best they can at an unappealing job. But in that threat, there's always a sense that at any moment something's going to happen to me, and guards will say like, "Oh, you're not gonna get out of here. We're gonna send your mother away, and you're gonna stay here, or we're gonna send you back and let your mother come." Any sort of thing that was just unnecessarily cruel. And so the results of the detention trauma is that we have these traumatic symptoms of trauma, right? Sudden, upsetting memories, nightmares, reminders of the threats and the humiliation that happens a lot in the detention centers. Kids reporting numbness, dissociative experiences in detention and after. Shattered sense of safety and well-being is part of what happens. And then, of course, the parents' own mental health and their capacity to parent adequately is diminished because they too are hurting. And the kids are now looking at their protectors who are now neutered. I mean, the parents cannot do anything. They can't cook their meals. They can't dictate what time they go to bed. They can't have their evening rituals that families have, or any ritual for that matter. So everything's taken away from the parents, and the child sees that, and then it affects the dynamics between them. So all of that is gone and eliminated. Then there's the traumatic separation, and this is where we get to what happened in 2018, which, by the way, started long before that. They were separating kids in 2017. I have to add this, that even in the Obama administration, the idea of separating kids was floated. Boom, but it went down like a lead balloon. No, it said, no, let's not even touch it. So it came up once, never again, until the Trump administration revived the idea of separation. And just to be fair, too, I was involved in at least 3 lawsuits, federal class action lawsuits, where I provided behavioral science background against the Obama administration, at least 3 of them, 5 against Trump, and already 1 against Biden. So I'm a equal opportunity litigious person, because I'm working it's not about the government, it's about the people that they are harming. And of course, during those 4 years that we just went through, it was worse. So the family separation policy of 2018 created this sudden, unexpected, inexplicable rupture of those relationships, the most human of relationships, causing distress and anxiety, then the rupture of the attachment bond, which I'll get to in a minute. And for clinicians, we would look at what DSM tells us about reactive attachment disorders, right? Which shows an inhibited, emotionally withdrawn child with limited positive affect, unexplained irritability, limited positive affect, and so on. So here I want to turn to what really happened to children during that separation process. And just to go back, I'm sure you all probably have heard something about attachment, but it's a fundamental human bond, right? It has lifelong implications. Depending how solid that early attachment and child rearing is, that helps establish, all sorts of things, including our interpersonal relationships and emotional well-being and so on. And a securely attached child is confident, has positive interactions with the parents after they've been separated and they reunite. When you send your kids, or whether when you hold your sister or someone babysits for you while you run to the store, it might be a couple of hours, and then you come back, and the kid runs to you. And that's that sort of natural. Sure, they don't like separating from you, especially the younger, of course. Teenagers, they want to be separated from you. But the young ones, they don't want to be separated. So that when they are, and then you come back, oh, mommy, daddy, they hug you once, and then they look in the bags to see what you brought them. But that's healthy. And by the way, the secure child is the modal child across cultures. We did some work early in the 90s on maternal interactions with children that resulted in securely attached children. We looked at Puerto Rican and Dominican mothers and non-Hispanic white mothers, and we found that the modal child was a securely attached child. But when you looked at the maternal behaviors, they were very different. So, for example, we had if in the white cohort, when a mom went and picked up the kid was playing, and picked them up and hugged them and kissed them and put them back down, that was associated with insecure attachment. The Puerto Rican and Dominican mothers did that, and it was associated with secure attachment. So it's something about how culture, kind of at what Lev Vygotsky called the zone of proximal development. What happens right there, that's where culture gets transmitted. And so that same action by 2 different mothers would result in different outcomes, or at least not result, but correlated with different outcomes. Anyway, so you get my point that attachment is good, but there are, of course, deviances. One, of course, is that insecure attachment after a period of separation, which is the insecure avoidant child, When the separation occurs and the reunion happens, the child expects rejection with the parent upon reunion and displays avoidance rather than seeking proximity. The kid who runs to you, is a securely attached child. The avoidance is, I'm not sure. I'll go with you, but I'm not really sure. And avoids you to reduce the anticipated conflict or rejection with the parent. And so here, I'm going to give you a case in point. This was 2018, and this is a hard video to watch, but please bear with me. This is a boy called originally Sammy. His name is Immers. He was featured on 60 Minutes about 6 months after this reunion at Bush International Airport in Houston. The story is that the father, mom, Immers, and his little sister arrived at the border but were separated. So the father and Immers, the boy, were taken away, and the mom was kept the baby. It's a little baby girl. So the father and son were moved to Arizona, and there they were separated. So the father was detained in Arizona, and the child was sent to someplace in Michigan, I think it was, to a foster family. And that went on for 3 months. So at this point, they bring Immers back to his father in Arizona. Father recognizes that something's wrong with his child. Then the two of them are reunited with the mom and the baby at this moment. So what we see is the reunification of this family after 3 months. And he's about a 3-year-old, maybe 3-year-old child at the time. So watch how he expects rejection and he avoids the caregiver. So this is what happens when this sort of traumatic separation occurs.
Mi amor, yo soy tu mami, papi, yo soy tu mami, dime, bebé, ¿qué tienes, hijo?
How do I pause this guy?
Dime, papi, yo le vine por ti, mi amor, dime. Exacto. Papi, vete que hablar, yo me vine por ti.
It's a hard video to watch. My wife refuses to enter the room when I'm working on a talk. You see how he's leaning back from his mother. Of course, she's delighted to, what mother isn't, right? 3 months, your baby boy. Father is clutching onto the baby. He hasn't seen his little baby girl, so he's holding on. You see Immers pulling away. That's part of the avoidant sort of attach. He's saying, oh, you left me once. How do I know you're not going to leave me again? Then he crawls away from her, and she's trying to pull him in, my baby, and he's looking away. And then he crawls over towards his father. And when I first saw this, I thought, well, now he's running to someone he's more familiar with. But what does he do? He really goes between father's legs and continues to the door. So he knows something about kind of getting away from things. This is a case of the insecure avoidant. And there were many cases like this that I was able to learn about during the time that we were doing the research after the 2018 family separation policy. Kids who were handcuffing their parents. Once they got home, they would play handcuff. Anybody who walked into the house got handcuffed, or this kind of awful, disturbed attachment reactions to their parents. So that's one of the things that occurs when you have these ruptured, connection. Another form, not the only form, of insecure attachment is what we call insecure ambivalent attachment. In this case, it's different, right? The child doesn't avoid, but the child is uncertain of the parent's response upon reunion. They're kind of checking out, I'm not going to avoid you, but I don't quite trust that you're going to be here for me when I need you. And then they might display this kind of passive, angry, resistant behavior that really sets to establish how close we're going to get. The kid is calling the shots, so to speak, right? When the parent responds, the child is ambivalent and not necessarily comforted by the parent, right? So that's kind of, I'm not sure about you. Another form, there's a attachment D or something like that. It's disorganized, kind of kids who are really almost look psychotic, but that's not anything I've been able to see. So in this case, we have something similar. Here's a boy in a shelter, had been separated from his mother. Now they've been reunited, they're in a shelter. And you'll see that he's uncertain of his caregiver's affection. And he's really angry and resistant to her. This is a clip from a much longer video. Earlier in the video, you see the boy, Henry, as his mother refers to him. Henry is playing with mom. They're getting along fine, playground, the whole thing, he's fine during the day. But something happens at night before he is to go to bed. This is, kind of settling in for the evening, seems to be the point at which this attachment issue and the trauma of the separation is most evident. So here's how it goes. Oops.
Quiero ir a la casa. Ya no me quiere.
¿Quién te ha dicho que no te quiero?
Ya se debe mi mamá.
Henry, toda esta separación fue muy larga. Mi hijo ya ha cambiado mucho. Con tanto trauma. Ya no quiero ser tu hijo, ya no soy tu hijo, me dijo.
So we see in what he's saying, I want to go back to jail. He's really unsure about, about her. It leaves you wondering what happened at night before he went to bed in wherever he was, a foster home or some kind of congregate care of children. What must have happened that when it's the settling time, evening, when we all, let go of reality, as Freud said, right? When we go to bed, we have to go into that transitional time of leaving the waking world and entering the world of sleep. What it must mean for little Henry, and he voices it. Now, these are some of the questions. We don't have to answer these today, but how would we intervene with these cases? As clinicians, we've got to think about how do we intervene with these cases. What parenting work do we need to do with each of the two parents? What about the mental health services for the parents? Just look at the first mom who just doesn't know. She does know that my child has been traumatized. The other mother, there's a sweetness and a caring, and she acknowledges him. ¿Quién te dijo eso? Why? But I'm your mother. As a clinician, I would work with each of these moms differently. In the first case, you might want to slow down in making the connection, and helping the mom not chase the child around. That may not be the best thing, but rather how to begin to kind of titrate her approaches to him and to allow him some room. Actually, in the 60 Minutes segment that they appeared, she was trying to do that, but she still talked about a boy who was rather strange. The other mother is really kind and understanding. I think with respect to the work we might do, one mom might be, kind of have to be drawn along. This one, it's really helping her strengthen what she's already doing so kindly, so sweetly with her child. Then we have to think of what services are in the community. And this is where, kind of anything I want you to think about, and those of you in Zoom, what do your communities need to do? These kids are coming all over the place. They're arriving in your communities left and right, and we're not prepared. Although President Biden issued an executive order within a month of his taking office, that said we've got to provide these children, especially those who are separated, mental health services. And the contracts have gone out. These large, Beltway bandits have gotten their share, and they're trying to penetrate the country with these services, but we don't really know it. And very few organizations are really prepared to serve this community. So we've got to think about what is it that they need, and what can we do to make sure that the children's futures, right? Parents are thinking about their children's futures. As clinicians, we need to think, and service providers, we need to think about these children and families' futures. How are they going to settle and adjust to the communities? So how must we respond? So that happens in detention, happened in the time of separations. But then there's the post-release, which is the fourth in the stages that we identified. And after the release, you see they have the release, and then they go into this long period in which they're now in our communities. They're getting immunized, they're entering schools. That's the settlement part. You know, parents are getting employment, housing, they're connecting with schools and churches and healthcare settings, all of that. There's still way in the distance a hearing. It's years from now. But these young kids are going to be Americanized pretty quickly. We all know how rapidly children acculturate. Once they're in school, they ditch the Spanish, they want to learn the English because they want to fit in. So there's a settlement, but there's also the psychological adjustment that takes place, which is the child's psychological well-being after having gone the trauma in their home countries, the traumas and stresses during the migration, and then the detention experience. So we've got layers to work on as much as possible. I had one boy at the detention center who said he was seeing this psychologist, let's call him Dr. Cruel, how's that? Who wanted to talk to him about his trauma in detention. I mean, you don't want, any first year, I hope, social work student knows it. You don't start talking about that stuff when the kid is still immersed in it. That's for later. Right now, you want to help repair, help coping, help him prepare. This is not the time to do your psychoanalytic exploration of trauma in the child. So anyways, that's my beef about Dr. Cruel. So anyways, all right, I'll stop. Sorry. That's can't help myself. And then we've got another group of kids, the unaccompanied children. I was in Pecos, Texas, to an emergency intake center where they had kids, 1,300 kids in tent of cities, tent city. And they were all teenagers, but the kids were incredible. You could see the sadness, the experiences, but also the optimism, and they're teenagers. They're teenagers, of course, they're shoving and goofing and saying hello and trying out new things. And they were speaking to us in English. Hola, how are you today? Anything, you could see them wanting to. And so these are the kids that are now, and they were there waiting placement with the sponsors here in the United States. But there are the younger groups. And this happened back in 2021. I have to show you this because this is incredible. The two little Ecuadorian sisters who were dropped on the border. And what happens here, and I'll narrate because there's no sound, they were dropped near Santa Teresa, New Mexico, which is west of El Paso. And as you see, the man is straddling, he tries to break the fall of the 5-year-old, boom. She seems to be stunned. He's reaching on the other side, he's not waiting, reaching on the other side, and notice the baby, she hasn't moved. So he takes this other child, the 3-year-old, and he pulls her over. And he's also trying to break her fall. The other one's getting up, he drops the baby, boom. I beg your pardon, it was the other way around. The baby is first and then the older sister. So now the other one, she goes up to her sister to say, what can you imagine these children saying? The guys are running away. How are you? Are you okay? The pouch that he dropped included the baby's identity papers and one telephone number in the United States. So what's interesting about this is that the next morning, of course, the talking heads on television were saying how brazen these coyotes and they're criminals. And I said, no, I wrote an op-ed and got hate mail for it. But I guess I did my job. Because these coyotes brought these children safely from Ecuador. So they did their job. They brought these, and when they were the CBP, Customs and Border Protection people, got them a physical exam, they were doing fine, no harm. So you might say, and then I was at a meeting in Rio Grande Valley, and one person said, that's child abuse. These parents should be, the parents who had sent the money to bring them to the United States should be arrested for child abuse. No, I think this is what parents will do in in a position of suffering, they will do what they can to save their babies. Although, I mean, I've got granddaughters literally this age. I can't imagine. I cannot imagine having them out of my sight. I mean, the second one was born premature. She was in the hospital 3 to 6 weeks. I was there every night with the parents. And that was in a really, high-end hospital with all the, neonatal care, all of that. I mean, stuff, and nurses and monitors. And I was worried. Can you imagine what it was like knowing my babies would be coming from Ecuador at the hands of coyotes? But these coyotes did their work. So that brings us to some other questions, right? How do we assess these girls? In the other two cases, the moms and the fathers could give us some idea of the kid's history. When he started speaking, his health, did he have any medical conditions? We don't know anything about these babies. We don't know what happened to them along the way. So we, as clinicians, as providers, have to think about how do we assess their mental health? And what do we tell parents to watch for when the girls are at home? And what services would the family need in this community? And how can our organizations, social service organizations, make it so that these families will do well? I'm going to stop there. I'll skip the neurological stuff and get to the various clinical interventions, much of which you all already will know, individual, child, family, child parent, and things like that. And I'll stop there and open it up to questions. Thank you. Sorry for rushing at the end.
We should have some moderated questions on Zoom and then close.
Before I answer your question, let me just say that I realize that you came out today and those of you on Zoom came out today to hear a talk, and that you saw videos and pictures that were really disturbing. I think if they really have, if you feel disturbed, I'm happy to talk with you. But also, you've got people around here, all of whom who just went through the last hour together, and we can perhaps help one another deal with this. I mean, this is the reality that we as social workers have to face day in and day out. But I do think it's worth, us taking a few minutes to take comfort this afternoon. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I was kind of just wondering, I guess, the similarities, because my background is working with mixed status families in the Midwest, but more focusing on the after effects of worksite immigration. Oh, thank you. Worksite immigration raids, where ICE agents come into a workplace where they detain and deport people, and so I guess the aftermath, in the sense of, there is still family separation, or just even with children. I just kind of wondering, I guess, what is the similarities you see with your work, and how it kind of translate with what's going on in the interior, I guess, with the presence of ICE tactics of raids, or just regular immigration policy in the U.S., and how that affects the development of U.S. born citizen children, but with undocumented parents.
Okay. There's a lot, the similarities. One of them is the hypervigilance, right? They have to always be looking over their shoulders. Children who are here or whose parents are here without documentation have to be ready to hide in the shadows as soon as things come up. And in the book Forgotten Citizens, which is precisely about this, I have cases where kids were taught that you kept quiet. You don't draw attention to us. You don't act out in Walmart. Many of my well-established liberal friends will let their kids throw tantrums in Walmart. They don't have to worry about being deported or anything else. But I think they grow up with that. They know the rules. The rules are you don't talk and you don't behave. All sorts of things that they have. These kids will grow up also with that until their situation is settled. So there are similarities, but indeed there are differences, because the U.S. citizen child can stay. Their parents may be deported. Some parents will take their children back with them. Some will leave them behind, which is why I called some the exiles, and those who are left behind the orphans. But we can talk more about that. But yeah, there are similarities, although citizenship, birthright citizenship, is good and has something to protect it.
Thank you.
Hand up here. The microphone is coming to you.
One on Zoom, really. Oh, okay. Hi, Dr. Zayas. Thank you so much for your work and your leadership in this area.
Thank you.
My name's Christine, and I've been following your work for many years. I just wanted to ask a question regarding this new, regarding basically the folks who were brought here from, or who migrated from Venezuela and who arrived in those southern states where there was extreme disenfranchisement and brought to other places in the U.S. I was just wondering how you might incorporate that into the model, because essentially, not only in terms of the current situation where they are here in the U.S., now the post-migration status is further disenfranchisement being brought to, essentially being trafficked
Yeah.
to another place where services, like you said, may not be in place, and people are not necessarily, I mean, they're expecting to see potentially relatives in Houston or in wherever, Florida, but essentially there's this other layer
That's right.
of difficulty. So I'm just wondering,
Well, let me just say that when I began this particular type of work with asylum-seeking families, it was in 2014, and they were primarily from the Northern Triangle countries of Central America. But you're right that more recently, the Venezuelans, Haitians, Cubans have joined that group. And they, while the migration at the point that they arrive at the, say, Chiapas or the southern border of Mexico may be similar, the origins, right, whether it's Haiti, or Cuba or Venezuela, will be different. And maybe that's my next grant, right? To look at those families. But incidentally, we saw Congolese moms who had managed to come from Africa to places like Venezuela and Colombia with visas, and then started literally walking. So we've had a large number of Africans, Nigerians included. So it's something I need to see, because we've got a project in Orlando. Actually, I'm just a part of it. It's run by Seth Schwartz, who used to be at the University of Miami, he's now at Texas. We're looking at Venezuelans who came earlier on and have settled in in Florida, not southern Florida, but Florida, Orlando, places like that. So we're looking at what's happened with them. We hope to be able to publish some of that. But those are, and so those of you who are looking for work, what I mean, work on your dissertation, topics for study, that would be a great contribution. Okay, Zoom question?
Yeah, we have a Zoom question from Joanna. I've read about other suicides among immigrants detained in for-profit prisons. Do you know the scope of this problem?
No, I don't know the scope, but there was something recently in the Times also, or the Washington Post, about a suicide in Torrance, in one of the facilities at Torrance, also where the individual, in most cases, the individual has shown suicidal behaviors, ideation, talked about it, depressive affect, not eating. Even other detainees are saying, "Oh, something's wrong with her or him." There have been other suicides, but they haven't gotten the attention that they deserve by the press, because ICE, the Homeland Security, keeps that under tight wraps. Now, in the suit that we're involved in, I've been able to read all of the documents, and it was terrible. They just simply let the man go about saying what he's saying, and no one did anything. And he was in a cell with his son when he suicided. So it's and no one came to watch. You read about it in prisons, right, where the guards didn't check on them the way they should every 30 minutes, or they're on suicide watch. Just nothing. And then they didn't even have neck braces for the hanging, or they didn't open the doors for EMS, the local EMS, to get in. It's just awful. But that doesn't make the headlines, because there's so much they cover up. I don't mean cover up. I'm trying to look for another word, but they just don't let it see the light of day. Yes.
Hi, Dr. Zayas. My name is Ivan. I'm a third year. And my question to you is, I'm a political science major, so and I have a great interest in social welfare and immigration. And so I know I know and value the impact of policy. So how do we make, I guess, politicians, who tend to be on the more conservative side, how do we make them care, right? Because they're I guess understandably, but I guess to me it's wrong. Their focus is on their constituents and what their constituents think, right? But this is a humanitarian problem
That's right.
that exceeds politics. So how do we make them care?
You ask the hardest questions that I can ever imagine getting. I don't know. I mean, Governor Abbott is married to a Mexican woman. And yet he tramples over immigrant rights like nothing. And his wife doesn't tell him, bed at night, jerk. I wish she would, maybe, but I don't know what we can do. But we do know that anecdotal evidence, when a legislator hears in common English about what happened, they may be more likely to change. Although right now we're so polarized that you hear that word a lot, we're just on entirely different, points in the continuum of whatever. That I don't know what we can do. But let me speak to something. I don't know if this was part of your question, but I'll answer it because I want to make it part of your question, which is how do we go about it? I think as social workers, I think we need to really be confident in what we know and be able to be prepared to testify in immigration court, in federal lawsuits, in state legislatures, in the federal legislature, Congress, and the Senate, to be able to speak confidently about what we know and what we see. Unfortunately, I don't see enough of that. The other is that I've told my undergraduate students who are getting their BSWs, you don't all have to become MSWs. I would like some of you to go get your MBAs and some of you to get your JDs, because my team, the teams that I work with, are attorneys who care and care deeply. So together, I bring in the behavioral science knowledge. They know all the other law and stuff. And I think together, that's where we can persuade, because even though we've won just about every federal lawsuit that I've been involved in, including one on DACA, the governments have done runarounds. That happened with the detention of children and the separation. The Trump administration just kept doing what they were doing. And at one point they were going to say, okay, so we won't detain the kids, we won't separate the moms and the kids, we'll just detain them for indefinitely. Okay, that's not quite the solution. So, even there's a point at which people have not even observed the law or what courts have done. One of my heroes, by the way, lives here in this state, and she is Judge Dolly G. in the LA federal court. She is the one that held Obama's feet to the fire, Trump's feet to the fire. She is dogged. They still have not her point was release the children from detention to families. But she has not given up. I think you should look her up. She's really terrific. Anyways, I thought that's what you were asking, so I'm answering it because that's the question I wanted you to ask. Yes.
Hi, I work in a K-12 Central Valley, California school system, and my question to you is, do you see good practices in school districts that are supporting our students that have struggled with these traumas?
Oh, good question. I have seen some schools do really well and other schools not do so well. And this comes from evidence I got at a meeting in Washington, D.C., where we got together with local schools through the National Hispanic Latino Mental Health Technology Transfer Centers, where some of the schools were doing really unique things to make sure that those kids were brought in, particularly during the COVID period, right? Where kids didn't come back to school, they reached out. Other places, and by the way, one of the places that was doing really interesting things was in West Virginia. It's not a place I think about, who could, but they were doing really good work. As well as some areas in Virginia and Maryland, but not all of them uniformly. But I have seen some models. And I imagine you've got school districts here in California who are doing some good things, others who might be missing the point, but who could be informed and advised and brought along to be, to help these kids in the classroom. And what we do know, immigrants think education is everything, and we wouldn't disagree, right? And so they honor the value of education. We find that it's easier to get them to come to school and get mental health services there than to get them to the mental health clinics. So if we could do more school-based mental health, that would be ideal, because it's easy for a parent to walk into a school. There's no stigma attached to going to see the counselor, the psychologist, the social worker, whoever is whatever else is there. That's critical. So I hope that gives you some answer. Yes.
We have two more Zoom questions.
Okay.
Erin Carrison is going to unmute herself
Okay.
and ask directly.
Sorry, I didn't have unmute permissions. Welcome. I love seeing Boricua energy in California. Yes, I'm a fellow one. Welcome.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, my name is Erin Carrison, and I'm a professor in this school, and I also study punishment. And my question, you started with the cruelty. The cruelty is the point, which I would agree, but there's lots of different ways to be cruel. So
Yes.
watching the babies, I don't know his name, Henry was saying, you don't love me anymore, you're not my mom, this, that. I'm curious to know what is happening with case management with children, like before we're doing any sort of reunification or even starting that discussion, because I'm also very curious about what's happening with children unaccompanied who are kidnapped and then adopted by other white folks wherever. And so I'm wondering what is happening with priming children to say, yeah, they left you. You could say they love you and create a longing as part of the cruelty. Instead, it's a cleave. And so I'm very interested in, particularly in a for-profit space where folks with a lot of money, right, can come to, no questions asked, and really baby snatch. And I'm not being hyperbolic because we have a history of that in the US of stealing babies. So this is a space I know very little about. So I'm really asking, might there be a connection there? And is my cynicism, deserved, merited, I suppose?
Well, from one Boricua cynic to another Boricua cynic.
Gracias.
We're okay. We don't have any sort of uniform or mainstream kind of case management approaches at this point that I can speak of. We do have, the tried and true therapies, parent-child interaction therapy, parent management training, things like that, which we can adapt to these groups, but it's hard to tell what's happening nationally. Here and there, I do these talks to both clinical audiences and academic audiences. The clinical audiences are desperate for learning more about what we can do, but there's no real kind of base, right? Empirical base, even if it's practice-based evidence, not necessarily empirically based practice, evidence-based practice, but practice-based evidence where people are doing things in their communities that we could learn from. We need to get those out more. So I wish I could tell you more, but.
Okay. I just want one more moment. That's not what I'm asking.
Oh, okay.
With these interviews and sort of in your own observations, do you know anything about the discussions that are taking place between whomever is doing case management in these sites? And what is the messaging that children are getting? So I know maybe you don't.
Yeah,
get this-
I'm sorry, I don't
but high
have
school
that kind of question. I do know that they don't provide much case management in the detention centers. It's in the, when they get out in the shelters that usually run by nonprofits, where then they start getting some case management.
Got you. Thank
Okay,
you.
Thank you very
so
much.
much.
Thank you.
Okay, we have one Zoom, and then we'll go to one more question in the audience, I think. So this is from Holly. What intervention do you recommend for unaccompanied minors who have experienced trauma, who present in residential setting or foster home, post-detention, that everything is fine to prepare them for eventual release? Some hold their traumatic experiences with amazing steadiness and courage.
To answer the part about what we would do, we have a long way to go to be able to develop ways and also to adapt those that we have at hand. What we do need to understand is that many of these kids, yes, they've got, especially the older ones, who have gone through traumatic events, kind of know that they were facing these. And so when you think about trauma, you have to think about how prepared were you for that? What are the genetic, your constitutional strengths, and as well as, what you understood would be happening to you in this migration. That tends to reduce the chance of trauma. So for example, if you know you're heading into a tough situation, you're more prepared, and so stuff will come at you, and it may not be less traumatic than if you walk into it without any awareness. So we do know that has some level of kind of a protection. I don't know how else to answer that question because there's so much we need to do. And so we're early on. So even when we're asked, so what happened to these kids in detention? We're just analyzing our data now to know what happens 3-4 years later, because that's when it really begins to show, right? During the period in which they're in detention or the migration, they may have been able to manage the stresses, but we all know that once you're rested, periods of quiescence, that the stuff begins to bubble up from the unconscious, memories start, and then kids develop the whatever the symptoms are. We had 2 boys, actually brothers, who survived it well, and then when they were situated, the mom was telling us how they both had like almost this, folie à deux depression for a month. Both of them would not leave their rooms. And they probably were supporting one another, but that's the moment that she says, my kids have been ruined, I think were her words, because that's when it all happened. One more question.
Hi, Professor Zayas. Thank you for your talk and sharing your work with us.
Thank you.
My name is Douglas. I am particularly interested in strategies to reduce and or eliminate the use of detention. Particularly community-based case management seems promising, non-surveillance, non-restrictive type of program. I was curious if you'd be willing to share, if you're familiar with that, and your perspective and possibly any critiques of implementing that.
All right, so a good question. I began this work in 2014. What's that now, 6 years, give or take? We could have gotten it right. Now I understand that in 2014, remember the spring surge, there were 64,000 mothers at, in not San Antonio, McAllen alone just came in with 64,000 families of people, including moms and kids. And I understand that we had to do what we could. But 6 years later, we're still detaining people. We could have taken old military bases and created campuses where families could live together through the process of the processing, and resettlement. We could have gotten hotels, that have been abandoned or closed and used those as places. Why do we still have detention centers? Because cruelty is the point. I think, and deterrence, the idea that if you separate them, you detain them, you do all sorts of things, you bust them, that will send home back the message, don't do it. Deterrence hasn't worked. So what we need to do is really create refugee resettlement centers, so to speak, right? They might spend a lot of time there, but we know that they'll be well-fed, safe. We can educate the kids, families can resume their lives, and some will be deported, that's inevitable, but many of them will stay in this country. We could have gotten it right. What we don't have is will. We've got the resources, I can assure you that, to do that. Because if you're paying these private prisons $300 per bed per night, thousands of them, I'm sure there's agencies right here in Berkeley and Oakland who could probably do it for far less and do a far better job with the sensitivity and care that they need. So it's just political will. It hasn't happened. And remember too, I remind you too that these private prison companies are contributing to the campaign coffers of many senators and congresspeople, so representatives. So, until we stop that, we're not going to get very far. But I do think we should have been able to create along the border, instead of these transient camps, we could have done something more solid. I could rant on, but I think you get my point. Yes.
I still don't understand the premise of the need for detentions. Are we saying that we can't take a name and what do we do there? Like, what does it take months and months to do? Collect information, and then folks go, and we don't know where they're at anyway. So I really don't understand the fundamental point of detention at its core.
There is no point. Oh, what's the point of detention, in short, is the question. Why detention? Again, it's punishment, but the detention centers don't do a very good job of, working on where you're going, finding your sponsors, setting you up. There's not much of that. Those things are done by the nonprofit sector. They do a good job of vetting people and getting them. It's actually gotten better. When I started in 2014, families were in there for 2 years sometime. Now they're supposed to be there no more than 21 days. So it's gotten, but there was a story of a little boy who was 3 years old who had spent 2 of those years in a detention center in Berks County, Pennsylvania. But there was no rhyme or reason because he had already been found by the immigration authorities to be eligible for, he and his mother, to be eligible for release, but they weren't released. Now it's different, but it's still, there's no point to it. There is absolutely no point. They do better now with the unaccompanied kids because it's under the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is under DHHS, and they move on quickly to try to find the sponsors. And I see people nodding and everything, and I think my time is up because Professor Organista is about to bring out the hook. So thank you all very much for coming out this afternoon and listening to this difficult talk, but I appreciate your presence here today.
Yeah, I think we're a tad over, maybe, but thank you for the generous responses to all the questions. You can see all the questions that would be generated by this topic. Just in closing, I want to thank you, Luis, for really embodying the spirit of the Freelander lecture, both in your intellect and in your passions. Very much appreciated. So thank you.
Thank you.